Open there to Isaiah chapter 47. If you need the notes, as usual, the men are ready to standing by to help you with those. So just hold your hand up if you need the notes for this morning. Preaching through the book of Isaiah. It's been a great book as far as helping me and challenging me, and trust it has been to you. And now we reach chapter 47. Message this morning is, As for Our Redeemer, or a subtitle, Time to Choose. Time to choose. God is dealing here in chapter 47 again with Babylon. Babylon, as we know, children of Israel were going to be taken into Babylon for 70 years captivity because of their sin, because not obeying the commands of God about letting the land rest for the Sabbath and those sort of things. And they were going to be in captivity for 70 years. God was going to use Babylon to do that, but also He's going to judge Babylon at the end of that for their cruelty and for their sin and for their wickedness. And so God again is dealing with Babylon. So I need you to remember with me just a little bit as we go into this to understand the context and understand what God wants us to decide on today. So looking back, we have to remember, who is Babylon? Who is Babylon? We won't go back and look at it, but back, I think it was chapter 14 is where we really studied Babylon to know what God is talking about and dealing with. We know that later on, when they go into captivity, Daniel and the three Hebrew children, all those folks were involved there in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar. Lots of information about this, but this is prior to them going in. And we understand God is preaching to Babylon right now, dealing with Babylon in chapter 47 through the prophet Isaiah. So we have to understand from chapter 14, we spent some time there, who is Babylon that God is dealing with? Who is this Babylon that God is chastening? Who is this Babylon, and what does it have to do with us? Well, I think you'll find it is us. At least as a nation, so much. Babylon, as we saw, Babylon symbolizes the world and its philosophies and its deeds. That's what Babylon is. It symbolizes the world, its philosophy and deeds. We're not talking about people. When we look at as God's dealing with their people, we're not talking, we talk about Babylon today. We're not talking about the people. We're talking about the system. We're talking about the philosophies. We're talking about those in power, if you will, or those who are taking us down that road. So it pictures the world. How many have figured out the world is not on God's side as a whole? It's just not. And you can tell very quickly we're going away. But that's what Babylon represents, the world system, the world's philosophy. We saw back in chapter, I think it was 14, the spirit of Babylon. This whole idea of what Babylon is, and it's the spirit. The word Babylon, if you think about it, we understand, we look at the Tower of Babel. It goes back to Genesis 11. The Tower of Babel was built up. That's the foundation. That's the beginning place of the Babylonians. It's that same philosophy as they wanted to build the tower. Let me just read Genesis 11, verse 3 and 4 for you. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they made brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So we find that's the spirit of Babylon. That's the spirit of this world. The idea is it's a spirit of independence from God. See, they said, let us. Let us. They didn't seek God. They weren't looking for God. This is early on in the creation of the world after Adam and Eve. But they just wanted that independence. They didn't want God ruling over them. They did not want God dictating them. So it was that spirit of being independent from God. If you look at chapter 47 and verse number 10, we find it's still there, and it's still in our society today as well. Isaiah 47, verse number 10. You there? Don't drift on me. All right, you got to stay awake. Verse number 10. For thou hast trusted in thy wickedness. Thou hast said, None seeth me. Thy wisdom and thy knowledge hath perverted thee. And thou hast said in thy heart, I am, and none else beside me. If you've been with us all the way through Isaiah, you know God over and over says, I'm He, and there's none beside me. He said, I am He, and there's nobody like me. Over and over God said that. Now Babylon is saying, I am, and there's nobody like me. In other words, Babylon says, we're God. We're our own God. We want to be God. We are like God. We are just as good as God. And that's what the spirit of Babylon is, this independence from God. Our society, our nation, our world right now has that same philosophy, that same spirit of wanting to be independent from God. That's why you can't pray in places. That's why Christ is pushed out. It was just a few weeks ago, maybe a few months ago, I was invited, as I've been in the past, to pray at some opening ceremonies. I think it was for Veterans Day parade or group. And he said, there's one thing you can't do this time, preacher. I said, what's that? He said, you can't use Jesus' name. He said, will that be a problem? And I said, that's a problem. He said, you can mention God, you can pray, but you just can't close it in Jesus' name or mention Him. We're living in Babylon, a nation and a world whose spirit is independent from God. That's what the Babylonians, as they built up that tower, same spirit there. It was the spirit of man's religion. It was a spirit for man's religion. Again, we just read in Genesis 11, it says that we may reach into heaven. They wanted to build a tower that would reach into heaven, not just so it would be big, not just so it would be tall, but they actually wanted to reach up into heaven, and they wanted to have their own access, their own route, their own ability to make it to heaven. That's man's philosophy today. It was the spirit of man's pride. They said, let us make a name. Let us make a name. So it was man's pride. We want to be somebody. We do not want God, and we're going to have our own way to heaven and our own religion. That is exactly the philosophy of the Babylonians, and it's our society today. So we're living with that same society. We saw not just the spirit of Babylon, but when we studied before, we saw the seduction of Babylon. The seduction of Babylon. Revelation tells us, gives us a hint into this spirit, the seduction of Babylon. It says in Revelation 17:5, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. In other words, Babylonians, that world's philosophy, seduces us. It draws us away from the things of God. It pulls us in. How many figured out the world's good at that too? Just watch the commercials. Just listen to the commercials. Just see everything. It draws us into the world's philosophy. And so this idea of Babylon, the seduction of it. And we studied about it in Revelation 18, about the lure and power of pride, the lure of wealth and the lure of the flesh, all through that. So God is dealing with Babylon. So as we look at ourselves, we can look at Babylon and we see what God says to His people about Babylon and about Himself. And then we can certainly tie it to us today because we are living in that same society, the same world's philosophy. So this morning, again, the subtitle is, it's time to choose. The challenge today is to choose who we're going to follow. To choose who we're going to obey, to choose who we're going to worship, to choose what direction we're going to go. Two great powers, two great influences are in this passage. All but one verse, well, maybe there's a couple of verses, but almost all the chapter deals with Babylon, their issues, their philosophies, and their concerns. And so we're being warned about that. But I want you to notice there in verse number 4, all of a sudden there's a spark. All of a sudden there's a great light. All of a sudden there is a contrast with all the things about Babylon and their society and what's going to happen to them and how they're going to fall out and all those things. But all of a sudden God just drops it right in on us. Verse number 4, as for our Redeemer. Boy, I'm glad we've got a Redeemer. I mean, even as He's dealing with the world and dealing with Babylon and dealing with the sin and bringing the judgment, He says, but don't forget there is a Redeemer. Don't forget there is a God on the throne. Don't forget. Notice what it says there in verse number 4. As for our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is His name, the Holy One of Israel. So as He's dealing with Babylon, He's challenging them, make a choice. He's telling His people, even while they're in captivity, He says, choose me. Remember your Redeemer. Remember who I am. If you remember, when Israel went into captivity in Babylon, they did their best to change the people. Remember, they took Daniel in, and his cohorts, his friends, gave them names after their gods, tried to feed them their food, educated them in their philosophy, trying to incorporate those young people as in, so when they would grow up, they would feel like Babylonians. They would think like the Babylonians. They would love like the Babylonians. They would have attitudes like the Babylonians. Have you figured out that's what the world's trying to do to us? That's what the world's trying to do to our kids. That's what the world's trying to do to church people. It's amazing to me how fast, in my 25 years of my life, how fast we've changed. How God's people, I'm talking about the people in the house of God. I'm talking about God's people, how they've changed to be so much like the world. In fact, most Christians today are more carnal and more sinful than the lost people in general were 40 years ago. As far as their language, as far as their attitude, as far as what they permit, what they watch, what they listen, what they say, it's just amazing how fast. Why? Because just like with Daniel, just like the Babylonians trying to get Daniel and his crowd to believe like them, to feel like them, to think like them, to see like them, so the world is after us. And so God is saying here, you're going to be in captivity. He says, but, he said, don't forget your Redeemer. There is a difference between the two. So this morning I'm asking us, it's time for us to make some choices. If we're going to ignite or let God ignite us and revive His work in the midst of the years, then we're going to have to start making God our choice. By the way, we make choices every day, every hour. You'll make a choice this afternoon about coming back tonight. I hope you haven't made it already in the negative. Hope you've already made it. Yes, I will. But you're going to make a choice. You'll make a choice. Will it be after the Babylonian or will it be after the things of God? When we think of... Babylon wants you to enroll your kids in Sunday soccer. God wants your kids to be enrolled in Sunday school. Hello. We say, well, I want my kids in soccer. Uh-huh. Now, by the way, there's nothing wrong with soccer. When I grew up, it was a kind of a communist game, but that's all right. We grew up in Midwest soccer, and nobody played soccer. I mean, it was football, basketball, and baseball. That was about it. But there's nothing wrong with soccer. But when it takes the place of God, when you have to choose soccer over Sunday school, then there is a problem. And no matter what it is, so it's that Babylonian thing. So they're going in and he's trying to make them, Babylon's trying to make them like they are. So let's make our decision today that I want to follow God. It's time to choose. Again, that amazing spark, that one verse, verse number 4. He's dealing with the nakedness and the wickedness and the judgment of Babylon, but he drops in, as for our Redeemer. Oh, he says, don't forget. God reminds His people to choose wisely. Oh, we got to choose wisely. The whole idea is, consider the end of Babylon. He talks about that. He says, what's going to happen with Babylon? Verse number 11. We'll be done with the introduction in just a second. Verse number 11. Therefore evil shall come upon thee. Talking to Babylon as he judges them. Thou shalt not know from whence it rises, and mischief shall fall upon thee. Thou shalt not be able to put it off. The desolation shall come upon thee suddenly. God says, and you won't be able to put it off. He said, when I bring judgment, you're not going to be able to put it away. When I bring judgment, you're not going to be able to put it off. Somehow we've got the idea that we can put off God. The world's got the idea is even if there is a God, they think, He doesn't have any power, He doesn't have any might, we'll be able to put it off. That word, that little phrase there, put it off, in the Hebrew means to atone for sin. So he says, you won't be able to make atoning. You won't be able to put it off. You won't be able to, judgment is going to come. So God says, knowing Babylon, what's going to happen to Babylon, He said, remember your Redeemer. As for our Redeemer. So this morning we're going to take this passage and we'll let God speak to us again so we can choose to seek and to serve and to follow Christ in Babylon. Because we are in the battle for our spirits and for our souls and for our nation and for our kids. So very quickly, let's learn from it. Let's make the choice. Let's look very quickly. Notice the corruption of Babylon. We won't go very deep in this because we say, preacher, I don't understand what that means. Just look around. Just look around. We are living in Babylon. We see the corruption of Babylon. The corruption of Babylon. Verse number 8. Therefore, hear now this. Thou art given to pleasures, that dwelleth carelessly, and say in the heart, I am, and none else besides me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. First of all, we see their wantonness. Their wantonness. They were just overall bad. They were overall just given to the flesh. That was just what they did as a matter of course. It was just the wantonness of that society. Notice what it says. They chose pleasure. Verse number 8. Thou art given to pleasures. In other words, that was their choice. They gave themselves over to pleasure. They gave themselves over all decisions based upon pleasure. Does that sound like the Babylon we're living in today? It's all pleasure. If it's not fun, why do it? That's what they say. But they gave themselves to pleasure. Well, let's make sure we're not, Babylon wants to do the same thing to us. Let's make sure that we don't choose pleasure over service. Let's make sure we don't choose pleasure over duty. Yeah, nothing wrong with having some pleasure. God certainly blesses us. God certainly gives us much joy and much pleasure. But the problem is we choose this fleshly or worldly or Babylonian pleasure over righteousness. We choose it over duty. Parents today are choosing pleasure over their kids. Well, what you say, preacher, I've got these kids, but what about my pleasure? You should have thought that before you had kids. Hello? Because once we have children, God gives us the children. It becomes our responsibility to care for them, to instruct them, to be examples of them, and to make sure they're on the right track and give all ourselves to them so they can be used of God. But the problem is today, we are people like the Babylonians. We've given ourselves to pleasure over our kids. Spouses have given themselves to pleasure over their spouse. Christians have given themselves to pleasure over the things of God. Such wantonness. Not only were they given to pleasure, it says they dwelled carelessly. Look what it says in verse number 8. Thou dwellest carelessly. They were careless over what was right and wrong. Just careless. They just didn't mind it. They didn't evaluate it. They didn't judge it. They didn't weigh it out and say, is this good? Is this bad? Is this better? Is this worse? They just lived carelessly. We're in a society today like Babylon. Don't forget our Redeemer. Just thought I'd throw that in there. All right, don't get too pulled down. But God's trying to say, look at the world. He says they are just living carelessly. But today we don't evaluate. We don't judge. The Bible talks about having our senses exercised to discern good and evil. Again, one time, and I'm not talking about just good old days. I'm just talking about at one time in our nation. Even the lost at least tried to put on an appearance of trying to be right, trying to be honest, trying not to be immoral, trying not to be vile. But we live in carelessly today. Well, as Christians, let's don't live carelessly. Let's take care of our Christian walk. Let's take care of our family. Let's take care about our relationship with God. Let's take care of just being careful about things. They were just wanton, though. Not only were they wanton, but we see their wickedness. Their wickedness. And the Bible tells us they trusted in it. Verse number 10. For thou hast trusted in thy wickedness. Thou hast said, none seeth me. They trusted in their wickedness. They thought, this is what we're counting on. This is what we're expecting. This is what we're going after. This is what's important to us. We're trusting in our wickedness. I've got news for you. And again, I'm not just trying to give us a chip on the shoulder. I'm not trying to just tear down the world. I'm trying to get us like God saying, listen, this is Babylon. Choose wisely. But we're living in a society, and again, I don't have to go too deep, that's trusting in wickedness. They're trusting in immorality. They're trusting. That's part of the thing about this whole thing about this homosexual movement and all those things going on. They're trusting that is good. They're trusting that's going to help them. They're trusting in that. They're trusting in their immorality. They're trusting in lies. They're trusting in deception. They trusted in their wickedness. But not only was there wantonness in their wickedness, we also see their wisdom was a problem. Their wisdom was a problem. It perverted them. Verse number 10, for thou hast trusted in thy wickedness. Thou hast said, none seeth me. Thy wisdom and thy knowledge. You know, how many believe wisdom and knowledge is good? Too bad we don't have any, but it's a good thing to have that, all right? Thy wisdom and thy knowledge in general is good. We'll look at that. But theirs, it hath perverted thee. And thou hast said in thy heart, I am, and none else beside me. Their wisdom perverted me. In other words, the Babylonian wisdom. The wisdom of the world. The knowledge of the world. Not true wisdom, not God's wisdom, not true knowledge, but their knowledge, their wisdom, perverted them. It twisted them. It made them think crazy. It made them act wrong. It just perverted them. That's what they said. This is wise. This is the right thing. This is knowledge. God tells us, it warns us about the two types of wisdom. His wisdom and the world's wisdom. James 3:14. It says, "But if ye have bitter envyings and strife in your hearts, glory not, and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. For where envy and strife is, there is confusion in every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy, good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy." As we look at the world's wisdom, I tell you, it's the first and not the latter. It's just sensual, it's worldly, it's devilish, it's envying, it's strife, it's confusion. Their wisdom, their knowledge perverted them. We look at our society. The world's knowledge, or what they say is knowledge, is perverting them. How in the world can we live in a society that can kill their children? Because our knowledge, the fact that we came from a slime pool, has perverted us. Anybody would say God made man and God created man, they'd say that's a fool. No, that's wisdom. That's the Word of God. But the wisdom of Babylon had perverted them. So in our nation, what they say is wise, what they say is knowledge, what they say is true, which is false, because it's contrary to the Word of God and it's just false anyway, it perverts our society. So he's dealing here with the corruption of Babylon. Lastly, he points out their witchcraft. Their witchcraft. Verse number 12. "Stand now with thine enchantments, and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth." He says from being a kid, they've grown up with their sorceries and their enchantments. "If so be thou be able to profit, if so be thou mayest prevail. Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Now let the astrologers, the stargazers, and the monthly protagonisters," that's just talking about astrology, your tarot cards, or whatever you say. "Oh, I'm a Leo, or I'm a kumquat," or whatever those things are. That's those monthly. They were saying, "Boy, what month were you born under? Let me tell you about your future." He says, those are the ones that are there. And he's bringing judgment upon their witchcraft. Now, witchcraft isn't so obvious today, but it's still very, very present, even in our society. Tarot cards and channeling and astrology and all the things that go with it, all the mystic, all the spooks, all the things. It's just vile. It's away from the things of God. And so he's dealing with this corruption of Babylon, their wisdom and their witchcraft, just by the fact they went against God and against His principles. The Bible, He told the Jews, says, "You do not permit a witch to live." Yeah, I'm not saying we go out and kill witches, but I'm saying let's don't bring them into the church. Amen? Parents, I'm saying don't let your kids play the games. Don't let your kids watch the movies. Don't let your kids do that, because God says that's terrible, and God says that brings judgment, and it corrupts us. But the world wants us to think, well, that's all right. Isn't that cute? We see the corruption of Babylon. Again, we're living there. Secondly, we find the confidence of Babylon. The confidence of Babylon. Verse number 7, we'll back up. "And thou sayest, I shall be a lady forever." If you go back up to verse number 1, he's talking about how they're not going to be ladies anymore. They're not going to be the queens anymore. They're not going to be pure anymore. But in verse 7, "And sayest thou," he said, "in spite of all this, I shall be a lady forever." Babylon says, we're going to be fine forever. We're going to be pleasant forever. "So that thou dost not lay these things to thy heart." Because they said we're going to be all right forever, because I'm going to be a lady forever. In other words, they had such confidence. It says they could not hear the prophecy. They could not hear the preaching. They could not hear the teaching. They did not lay it to heart. "Neither didst thou remember the latter end of it. Therefore, hear now this, that thou art given to pleasures and dwellest carelessly, and saith in thy heart, I am, there is none else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. Such confidence. She says, I shall be, I am, I shall not. Just saying, I'm not worried about it, I'm just fine, I'm okay. In spite of the fact of God's judgment, in spite of the fact of my sinfulness, in spite of the fact of the preaching and the prophecy of what God's trying to deal with me, he said, I am just fine. Just being confident even in the sin, in spite of the wickedness, in spite of the godlessness, they still have that confidence. And Babylon around us wants us to believe the same thing. It's an amazing thing how Christians today can think we can forget God, cheat God, play with God's life He gave us and still be okay. Okay. Galatians 6 tells us, be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to the flesh shall the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall reap of the Spirit, reap life everlasting. Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. God's not going to be mocked. But here we sit, sin in our lives, abandoning the things of God, and yet we say, I'm all right. I shall be. I am. I won't have. It's just, we won't be childless. We won't be a widow. We're going to be just fine. We're going to always be. The confidence. Babylon once had that confidence. Boy, how many figured out the world has confidence? They don't need God and they shouldn't be afraid of God and they're going to be just fine. America believes she's going to be around forever. Rome probably thought the same thing. Very quickly, notice the comeuppance of Babylon. Only people my age or older ever use that phrase. How many remember they're going to get their comeuppance? That's a real word. I didn't make that one up. The word comeuppance means just deserts. And if you're not used to that one, it means deserved fate. The deserved fate. I mean, you got somebody who's always been giving you a tough time and stealing from you and rubbing. You say, well, one day they're going to get their comeuppance. That's what it means. It's going. Another way of saying it, what goes around comes around. In other words, they're going to get what they deserve. And so we're going to find their sin. We find what Babylon was doing. We found their attitude. We find their wickedness. We found their wantonness. We found all that. And God says, now He says, you're going to get your comeuppance. He says, you're not going to live that way forever. There will be a judgment coming. There will be something to be dealt with about that. Notice verse number 2. We find, first of all, the humbling. The humbling. Babylon thought they were something. Babylon thought they were just fine. They had the wisdom, they had the knowledge, they had the hanging gardens, they had all the power, they had all the might, they had all the influence, they didn't need anybody or anything. They were all set, yet they were living in wickedness. And God says, no, it's not going to end that way. It's going to be taken care of. First of all, we find the humbling. Verse number 1. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. The virgin daughter of Babylon simply refers to Babylon itself, the people of Babylon, the great city of Babylon. Sit on the ground. There is no throne. O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called tender and delicate. Oh, there's going to be great humbling of Babylon. No more throne, sit on the ground. No more throne, no more queen, no more called tender, no more called delicate, no more being wonderful. Come down off the throne. Great humbling. I believe America's in for some great humbling. Because we've decided we don't need God. We are living in that time of Babylonian. The great humbling. Verse 2. Take the millstones and grind meal. He's saying, you Babylon who were the queen, he says, now you're going to do the lowest job a slave does. Just grind. Remember that's what they did with Samson when they poked out his eyes and made him grind in the prison house, grind the meal. Such humbling coming. Right now they thought they were fine. When they took over Israel, they thought they were fine. But he says, no, there's a humbling coming. The comeuppance is coming. The end is coming. The judgment will come. But not just the humbling, we also see the humiliation. The humiliation. Verse 2, take the millstones and grind meal. Uncover thy locks. Make bare the leg. Uncover the thigh. Pass over the rivers. Thy nakedness shall be uncovered. Yea, thy shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man. The shame, nakedness, uncovered. We've forgotten God says nakedness is a shame. Hello? That's what He's trying to show me. He says it's being humiliated. He said this exposure of the flesh, this nakedness, He said that's a humiliate. He's trying to show them that He's going to bring judgment through that nakedness. Well, we live in a day and age where there is no shame in nakedness. The exposure of the flesh. I'm not... Oh, preacher, you're just so old-fashioned. Babylon's got you. You've grown up in Babylon so long, you think it's okay. It's fine. Sometimes we deal with young folks and older folks who... Smile at me, will you? You know, in our Christian school, we have the skirts for the gals, and they've got to be a certain length. Okay, come on. Say, well, what's too short? I would say nakedness is too short. And God gives us the definition of nakedness. Notice what it says. Verse number 2. Take the millstones and grind meal under the locks. Make bare the leg. Uncover the what class? Thigh. Pass over the rivers. The nakedness shall be uncovered. They uncovered the thigh, and He said, I uncovered your nakedness. God's definition of nakedness is exposing the thigh. Well, I've got a different definition. Okay, show me your verse. By the way, it's not just for the gals. Exodus 28, verse 42, He says the same things for the guys. And thou shalt make them, talking about the priests, linen breeches, to cover their nakedness even from the loins, cover their nakedness from the loins, even unto the thighs shall they reach. So God says for the men, He said for the priests, He said, don't be naked when you come worship Me, when you come serve Me. He said, make sure you've got those breeches, make sure you've got the things from the loins covering the thigh. So God in two places tells us nakedness is exposing of the thigh. So God's bringing humiliation on these folks by telling them, so I'm going to uncover the thigh. I'll expose nakedness. See, preacher, that is so old-fashioned. It's old-fashioned what God wrote right there. I'll go ahead and say it. I guess I haven't said it in years. Ladies, if you'll talk to your husbands, and if he's honest, or if you just want to go down to the mall and watch where a guy's eyes go, they go where the thigh is uncovered. Just trying to help us today to be in line with what God says. So we say, preacher, what's wrong with short shorts? What's wrong with bathing suits? What's wrong with... Oh, we live in a society called Babylon. Very quickly, notice the conclusion of Babylon. The conclusion of Babylon. Oh, we got to see it for ourselves. We got to see the nation that we're in. We got to see the world. Again, I'm not trying to put it down on us. I'm trying to help us realize we're living in Babylon. Just like the children of Israel says, but don't forget the Redeemer. Don't forget who our God is. Notice the conclusion of Babylon. Verse number 9. What's going to happen to Babylon? But these two things shall come upon thee. Verse number 8, He tells them, she said, I will not be a widow, neither will I know the loss of children. God says, but these two things will come to thee in a moment, in one day, the loss of children and widowhood. They said, nothing's going to happen to us. He said, those exact things are going to happen to you in one day. They shall come upon thee in their perfection of the multitude of thy sorceries, and for the great abundance of thine enchantments. He says, for all the sorcery, all the witchcraft, He says, that is coming. Verse number 11. Therefore shall evil come upon thee, and thou shalt not know from whence it riseth. In other words, it's going to hit you. You're not even going to see where it came from. And mischief shall fall upon thee. Thou shalt not be able to put it off. And desolation shall come upon thee suddenly, which thou shalt not know. Verse 15. Thus shall they be unto thee, with whom thou hast labored, even thy merchants from thy youth. They shall wander every one to his quarter. None shall save thee. He said at the end, he said, Babylon, you're going to be destroyed. You're going to lose it all. It's going to be suddenly. You're not going to be able to put it off. You're not going to be saved. He says that it's just going to come upon you suddenly in one day. That's the conclusion. Now, we sit here and we watch the world and say, they got more money than us. They've got bigger houses than us. They have more vacation than us. They seem to have all these things. Yeah, but remember the end. Remember the conclusion. That's what God tells to Israel. He said, the Babylonians are going to capture you. They're going to put you in their prisons. You're going to be in captivity for 70 years. He says, but that's not the end of it. There is an end coming. So you and I have to keep our eyes on the end. Keep our eyes on the end. This old world has an end that it does not want to see. By the way, our life has got an end. And the end is either heaven or hell. Not based upon what church we went to, not based upon how good we are, but what we've done with Jesus Christ. The conclusion of Babylon. That's why God tells us, He says, not be envious of the wicked. He says, the end's coming. It's not over yet. But we see the contrast to Babylon. And this goes back to the beginning and back to our thought for today. Let's choose our Redeemer. Let's choose Christ. Verse number 4. Again, we've seen all this. Their wickedness, their judgment, their running from God, they're telling they don't need God, and all the judgment that's coming, their humiliation, their naked, well, all those things. But there in verse number 4 again, it says, as for our Redeemer. I'm glad it's our Redeemer and not just the Jews. Our Redeemer. He talks about verse 1. He talks about their shame. He talks about the millstone, how they're going to be slaves. He talks about their nakedness. He talks about all these things. But he says, as for our Redeemer. Boy, I'm glad we can hear about our Redeemer. Oh, we got Babylon all around us. We see what's going. We see the direction. But let's not forget our Redeemer. Who will we choose today? Today we've got to choose our Redeemer. We have to focus on our Redeemer. We have to have our Redeemer lead us. We have to be serving our Redeemer. I know Babylon's big. I know they're raising us up to believe like them, to think like them, to look like them, to act like them, to sing like them. But I'm glad as our Redeemer. Let's choose Jesus Christ this morning. Very quickly, let's look at Him for the glory and for the blessings and for eternity. First of all, we see that our Redeemer is the Lord of holiness. The Lord of holiness. Look at verse number 4. As for our Redeemer. Oh, I'm glad we've done it. He said, but as for Him, don't. He said, yes, see Babylon, but our Redeemer. See the wickedness of the world? Yes, but our Redeemer. But see the wickedness of of the lost people? Yes, but as for our Redeemer, we're going to go at him backwards. The Lord of hosts is His name, the Holy One of Israel. He's holy. How much contrast can we be between God and Babylon? How much contrast can there be between the Holy One and the unholy world and the unholy system and the unholy sin? What a contrast. He says, but as for our Redeemer, He says, I know Babylon's bad. He said, I know I'm going to have to deal with Babylon. I know all these things. And He said, I've told you all these things. He said, but even while you're in captivity, He said, remember, I am the Lord of holiness. Oh, what a blessed Savior we have. The Bible says in 1 Samuel 2:2, there is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. There is nobody as holy as God. Amen. Woo, let's choose right. Let's choose our Redeemer. He's the Lord of holiness. Secondly, He's the Lord of hosts. He's the Lord of hosts. Again, verse number 4. As for our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is His name. The Lord of hosts. That means great crowd. That means great multitude. That means a great army. He is the captain of our salvation, and He is the Lord of a host. A great multitude of angels. Yes, there's Christians also, but of angels. Revelation 5, verse number 11. Listen to this. This is the Lord. He's the King of this. And I beheld and heard the voice of many angels round about the throne, and the beasts and the elders, and the number of them was 25. No. And the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing. Boy, he's Quit numbering them. He says 10,000s times 10,000s and thousands and thousands. Sounds like just a little kid. How many is there? There's a bunch. How many? Millions and billions and zillions and trillions and quadbillions. That's what he's trying to say. He said there's 10,000s times 10,000s and thousands. He says you just can't number them. And He's the Lord of all of that glory. Oh, you say, but the world's got us outnumbered. Just like when the prophet was out there and the servant he saw the city surrounded coming to get the preacher. And he said, oh, what are we going to do? And remember Elijah says, Lord, open his eyes. And all on the hills he saw surrounded, he says, chariots of fire and angels all around. He couldn't see. He said, more is with us than with them. Amen? Oh, you say, but the world's got us outnumbered. No. We serve the Lord of hosts beyond number. Let's choose Him. Oh, but Babylon, I know. But as for our Redeemer, He's the Lord of holiness. Absolute holiness. Let's follow Him. Let's serve Him. The Bible says, be ye holy as He's holy. He's the Lord of hosts, and He's also the Lord of hope. The Lord of hope. He's the Redeemer. As for our Redeemer. Now, the hope isn't just crossing your fingers. Hope is anticipation. That's the hope it's talking about. We anticipate that. We're hoping in that. We're expecting that. We are waiting on that. He is our Redeemer, the Lord of hope. Isaiah 43:14. Just read it not long ago. It says, thus saith the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. For your sake I have sent to Babylon and have brought down their nobles. Oh, He is our Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. 1 Peter 1:18. He's redeemed us. For as much as you know, you were not redeemed with corruptible things as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and spot. Revelation 5:9. And they sang a new song, saying, thou art worthy to take the book, and to open the seals thereof, for thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us, bought us back, saved us from hell, saved us from the devil, redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation. Whew. Bought with the blood. God says, the Redeemer. The Jews understood that. They were redeemed from Egypt by the blood of the Lamb, picturing the coming Messiah. And all the way through, the Redeemer. He's the Lord of hope. So, preacher, they got their sorceries, they've got their wickedness, they've got their confidence, they've got all those things, and I'm just being pulled and being drawn. Yeah, but as for our Redeemer, hello. When you go out this week and the world tries to tell you that you're nuts, and that you're wrong, and you're crazy, and they're right, and they've got all the power, and they've got all the might, and they've got all the right answers, they've got all the knowledge, and they've got all the wisdom, and they've got all this, and they've got all that, and you're going down the wrong path. And remember verse 4. As for our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is His name, the Holy One of Israel. So today, as we look at this world, let's choose. It's time to choose. As for our Redeemer. In the middle of this, by the way, Israel is going to have some tough times coming. They weren't going to put most of them in the Holiday Inn. It was going to be tough. And the world was going to try to change them. The sorceries that Daniel had to deal with there with the kings and Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and all the astrologers, all those things, he had to stand true. He had to choose. As far as my Redeemer. Let's just choose Christ. Choose the things of God. If you're here this morning, God's speaking in your heart about being saved. See, the Bible says we all deserve a place called hell, and that's where we're all going without Christ. But God commended His love toward us while we were yet sinners. Christ died for us. Why don't we choose Christ? Choose Him. Now, you can't come to Him on your terms. You have to come to Him on His, when He speaks to your heart, when He draws you to Him. Get saved today. Let's get separated today. We're going to go after Babylon, or we're going to go after the Redeemer. We're going to serve Babylon, or we're going to serve the Redeemer. As far as our Redeemer, let's choose Him. He's worthy of it. There's the question for us. Who are you following? Babylon or our Redeemer? Let's bow our heads, please.